Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar in our series of presentations designed to help Kansas companies expand their exports. My name is Jeff Willis, and I am the Director of the International Division here at the Kansas Department of Commerce. During today's session, we will return to a discussion started last month on supply chain disruptions. This is a complicated subject with many different aspects to it. So, for today's follow-up webinar, we will focus on the questions that people have shared with us by asking our two presenters for their thoughts and suggestions as to how best to continue to navigate a problem that does not appear to be going away anytime soon. Both of our presenters have extensive experience related to supply chains and are prepared to offer us their insights about this difficult business challenge. This session will be recorded and will be accessible via our website once it has been posted. We look forward to any additional questions you may have, so please post them at any time in the chat box. Towards the end of the program, we will go over those additional questions and hopefully have some good answers for you. We do have a lot to cover, so let's get to the program. Our first speaker is Jay Devers. Jay is an accomplished business development executive with an entrepreneurial background. He is managing partner of Bestway International Incorporated, Kansas City, Missouri. Founded in 1988, Bestway is a U.S. customs broker and international freight forwarder representing Hellman Worldwide Logistics since 2006. In 2017, Bestway International was presented the President's E Award for Export Service by U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, the highest recognition any U.S. company can receive for making a significant contribution to the expansion of U.S. exports. Jay is a 1993 graduate of Northwest Missouri State University with a BS in International Business. He is currently a board member of the International Trade Council of Greater Kansas City and the World Trade Center, Kansas City, and is active with the World Trade Council of Wichita, Kansas. He is the 2019 Legacy of Service Award honoree of the International Trade Council of Greater Kansas City. Well, without further delay, I give you Jay Devers.
Hi, Jeff. Good morning, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for taking the time, and Jeff and Kat and Mike at the Department of Commerce in Kansas. Thank you for putting this event on. That's a that's a heck of an introduction. I appreciate that. I think my mom's going to be proud of me once she hears that at some point. But that's very kind of you, Jeff, and I greatly appreciate it. Always a great honor to get a chance to speak with you this morning about what's going on. Some of these topics are not a lot of fun, but the energy of the international trade community to answer to some of the things that are going on right now is awesome, and it's really fun to be a part of. This morning I have a couple of comments, just a couple of slides on where we are in response to questions that have come in. And then also really just kind of additive to what we talked about in our last session. So I intend to keep my comments brief. Kind of one of the things I'd like to do is use them to stimulate some questions for Lesa and myself. And hopefully we can walk away with this small investment of time with maybe a little bit better understanding of what's going on out there and the path to navigating through the situation that we're all experiencing right now. So, Mike, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and jump into my slides. I live in a short attention span world. Slide decks to me are best when they're 10 slides or fewer, and presentations are best to me when they're 10 minutes or less. So that's kind of my angle of attack here. We can certainly dive into greater detail offline, but want to keep things moving and kind of hit the high notes. What I'd like to talk about today before we hand over to Lesa is really kind of the two big questions that we see out there right now in the trade community, which is when are things going to get back to normal? And what are companies in Kansas doing right now to survive and thrive this situation? It's a crazy environment. I was sitting in front of a client in Kansas just the other day, and they are in the holiday merchandise business. This particular customer has a number of containers that are sitting out destined for the Christmas holiday, which I think is coming up here next week, and they're still sitting offshore at Long Beach. So we are far from out of this, and definitely I don't think there's a company out there that we're dealing with that's not feeling some pain. So we'll advance the next slide, please, Mike. Again, my name is Jay Devers. Bestway International is my company. We're headquartered here in Kansas City. Been doing this since 1988. We are a United States customs broker and an international freight forwarder. Jeff's introduction was amazing. I'm kind of embarrassed to have to sit and listen to that, but that was awesome, Jeff. Thank you. So advancing to the next slide, let's just set the table real quick. Are you ready for me, Mike? Thank you. So, you know, I think we all kind of know where we're coming from, but the events that preceded our situation right now are basically, you know, just a massive collapse in international trade activity for a short period of time, which was followed by a massive surge, not only in the resumption of commerce, but also a change of buying patterns. And so this all happened, and we all lived through it over the course of the last 18 months. And what it basically did is it basically created some level of imbalance. It identified some level of inequities and some real problems inside almost every element of the supply chain. So depending on what business that you're in, but we certainly, I think most of us feel it in the area of trucking. Trucking is something that impacts all of us because that's that last mile of delivery. You know, we all know that the most visible part of this whole international trade mess is the Port of Long Beach and the stories of 80, 90, 100 plus container ships waiting to be offloaded. But it's far bigger than that. You know, it impacts the railroads. It impacts infrastructure and as it relates to chassis and container ships and things like that. The airlines are involved because freight has transitioned. People have transitioned out of flying and freight has transitioned into flying. And then, you know, last but not least, the warehousing situation and warehouse infrastructure, not only on the coast, but also here in the Midwest, and then access to labor to work in those warehouses. So if you really want to dive into this, which we won't do this morning, you can actually look at the entire supply chain breaking down in different places. And you ask yourself, well, how could this possibly happen? Well, we've obviously lived through an unprecedented series of events. But the second thing is, for those of you like myself who've been around for a while, you know, this whole ecosystem was kind of optimized around lean, you know, business principles and lean business practices. And I think there's a lot of people that would admit some of it was a little too lean. And so when you've got a situation like this where buying patterns change and traffic patterns change and equipment all over the world is out of balance and in the wrong place, you get to find out really the bad side of what happens when you take a lean set of operating principles and disrupt them as heavily as that happened. So I think for nothing else, we're all going to come out of this with a little different perspective on how to add a resilience to our business practices. There's no better expert than Lesa, my colleague, and she has got some amazing insights on how to do that. But before we get to her, I'll just have a couple comments for you about kind of what we think is going on. So Mike, I'm ready for the next slide when you are, sir. This is the worst part about this presentation. I hate this part. When will things return to normal? Not soon. So things are far from normal now, although we've seen a slight reduction in the last couple of weeks in fuel prices. We've seen a slight reduction in the last couple of weeks in the course of as it relates to ocean freight costs. We're far from our high water mark. But here we are, we have a massive international holiday next week. And then anybody that's active in this business, especially on the Trans-Pacific side of it, is now trying to figure out what is going to be the impact of Chinese New Year in 2022, which, you know, is just less than 2 months away. So we've got these cycles that we can't get out of that are going to make it hard. If we had a panel of experts here, I think, you know, you would see a consensus as it's going to be the other side of Chinese New Year in 2023. So we're talking about late spring, early summer 2023 before things really start to get themselves settled down. Now, are we going to go back to the freight rates of 2018 and 2019? Probably not. Looking at the benchmark cost for a 40-foot container from China to Kansas, back when things were normal, that was a $3,500 to $5,000 type of expense. Our high water mark we saw, I think, recently was $38,000. So you're talking about nearly unmanageable increases in costs. Are we going back to 4,000 or 5,000? I don't think we are. I think we're going to go back to and settle in on something in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 10,000. So these freight rates are not going away. But the reason it's going to take as long as we're talking about is there's so many things that are out of balance. There's so much equipment that is not where it's supposed to be. There's so many business practices in place now that have to be backed out and undone that it's just going to take a while to work through this. Next slide, please, Mike. Jumping right into what's happening. There's a balance going on. Obviously, we're adjusting to this massive surge of e-commerce and the warehouse and distribution capacity it takes to support that. The port capacities has been a very hot political button, I think, over the course of the last 45 days. Adding service time, negotiating away from labor strife, finding a way to add new drivers to the mix at the port and inland, and then continuing to try to get back to work, which sadly is heavily impacted as we look at surges in the virus, and then individual policies as it relates to how do the ports manage that, what is the quarantine policy, and I think we all can agree that's a little bit of a moving target. And then, of course, we have our natural cycles, what's going on. We have Chinese New Year coming up here in a few weeks. We have Chinese New Year 2023. We've got peak season. I can tell you in our world, we've got dozens of clients that are so far delayed in the receipt of their goods that, the only real positive impact is they're stocked essentially for their next buying seasons. So what is that going to do if you've got 20 or 30% of your shippers that are already pre-stocked because of the delays in receiving their goods? So a lot of stuff going on. Really, I think if you want to bet on this, let's bet on things not really being the way they should be until summer 2023. So next slide, please, Mike. So just a couple quick thoughts out there in terms of a consensual set of trigger points of what's going to happen to kind of unjam the situation right now. So real quick, just to run through this, we're talking about unclogging the ports and freeing up equipment. So we need these ports to operate more efficiently. We need to see a 24/7 operating model. We need to see more drivers, and then we need to see some disincentives for some of the bad behavior that's really hurt the business in the past. And I'm speaking specifically about purposefully limiting the ability to physically handle cargo in the port and nearby the port. For those of you who've dived into this, you've seen legislation and business rules around how high you can stack containers, where, how often the port hours are open, and of course there's a lot of finger pointing between the drivers and the steamship lines and the port workers in terms of who's responsible for why it takes so long to unload one of these ships. We need more chassis. This really hurts us in Kansas. This really hurts us in the middle of the country. Because of the limit of chassis. These are the frames that the containers ride on so they can make it on a truck to their final destination. Sadly, there's a trade dispute underway over chassis production. Most of the chassis production is in China, so that trade dispute is going to have to be worked out. Warehousing. For those of you who are active in the trade community here in the Kansas City area and in Kansas, you've seen massive increase, millions and millions of tens of millions of additional feet of warehousing to handle all this capacity that's driven primarily by the e-commerce industry. I was just reading an article this morning, and it said that as of yesterday, there is 0.07% open warehouse space within 100 miles of the Port of LA. Now, I don't know how they came up with that statistic, but that gives you an idea of the fact that, what happens when you get these containers off the ship finally? Where do they go? They have no place to go. And so that's a real problem. And then looking at a couple of the consensual trigger points, it comes down to truck drivers. So depending on what statistics that you look into, you'll see anywhere from 80 to 120,000 driver shortage. That our economy here in the United States is short that many truck drivers. Okay, what does that result in? Well, higher prices, delays, that sort of thing. So how do you fix that? Well, you've already seen companies like J.B. Hunt, Walmart is involved in this. They're increasing wages, aggressive increases in salaries, adding benefits. And then also there's the lowering of barriers to entry. This gets into a really sticky spot because we're just now coming off, a wave of new regulation in the trucking world that has caused a lot of consternation. There's drivers that have retired and left the labor force because of the changes in safety regulations, and nobody wants to be associated with a safety incident. These trucks are extremely heavy. They can be dangerous if not operated properly. And when you start getting into conversations about making it easier to be a truck driver or lessening safety regulations or increasing operating capacity, you're talking about a really slippery slope of potentially getting into more accidents and things like that. So that's not good. But those are the things that are kind of underway right now, and probably 5 of the things that are going to make the biggest difference as we navigate our way through the natural trade cycles that the world is in, prior to this massive disruption. Next slide, please, Mike. Really don't want to spend a ton of time on this particular slide. What I'm trying to lead you to is what we're looking for out there is resilience. Lesa did a great job last time talking about this, and I'm sure she'll do it again, but this is really kind of maybe taking a quick break from that whole lean management philosophy and really looking into where's my points of failure. So this particular slide just serves to illustrate that, there's only 7 places in the supply chain they can fail. Now, unfortunately, they're pretty big. But what we're doing and what managers are doing, and I also want to stress, this is by no means limited to trans-Pacific importing. We're dealing with clients every day that don't buy anything from overseas and are having terrific problems with their supply chain. So this is by no means an import thing. It's by no means a China or a trans-Pacific thing. This is affecting everything. But you can kind of look at this list and see that if you can go in here and you can build some resilience into these areas of possible failure, you're going to come out of the process with a little better approach to the supply chain and probably be in a lot better shape as we try to get through this. The next slide that I've got for you really is just kind of an example, ready when you are, Mike, of, okay, so what are people doing out there right now? When you talk about resilience, that sounds like a management buzzword that you might hear at in a college campus. But we're really talking about the ability to persist and adapt and transform. Going into each one of those areas and finding those little points of failure, those single, double, triple points of failure, and getting rid of those. So what are companies doing? I pulled this slide from McKinsey. I thought it was a good example of, here's 4 or 5 things that are happening. People are dual sourcing materials. This actually started before COVID because of our kind of trade policies that were happening with China. So people were already on a path to looking at nearshoring or looking at not sourcing in China to navigate their way around that. So that's a big thing. What you've got going on right now is increasing inventories. So we talk a lot about the availability of warehouse space and really the availability of warehouse labor, which is really tough. But now we're talking about maybe not being so attached to a just-in-time inventory process. Maybe we're going to kind of keep some stuff on hand and be ready for the next bubble. Nearshoring, regionalizing the supply chain. I had lunch with a client yesterday who has a massive project underway to regionalize their supply chain. They're here in the Midwest, and so they're finding, and they've got a team of people that are out there looking for suppliers that only have that one leg of the delivery to get to them. It's that local truck, and we know that we have a lot better luck and we have a lot better fortune with trucking here in the Midwest than they do on the coast right now. And then, of course, there's a lot of companies out there that are reducing their SKUs. The client I mentioned last week that still has holiday merchandise in transit, has increased their relationship with some of their customers, but they've also decreased their SKUs. Which, if you think about it, that's rather the opposite of this whole long tail strategy that I think Amazon has probably perfected, which is, why couldn't you just have an unlimited amount of SKUs? Well, when you have an unlimited amount of SKUs, then you've added just many points of failure. So looking at resilience, those are a couple things that's going on. Boots on the ground. What you're seeing is in our world, we're seeing finance people inside of organizations, obviously the logistics people and the compliance people, and they're dedicating some time and some resources and really drawing all this stuff out and trying to figure out how they're going to work around these issues and add resilience to those 7 points in the supply chain that are susceptible to failure. So, Mike, I think we're about done there. We're very close to being done. Yeah, the only thing else I would add before I conclude my part is we just have an incredibly robust international trade community in this area. Between Jeff and his team and Kat at the International Division, you've got an incredible group of people in Wichita at Kansas Global. You've got the International Trade Council here in Kansas City, World Trade Center here in Kansas City. Lesa and I try to do our best to be active in those organizations. But then I think about all the really smart economic development professionals that we have all over the state of Kansas, some of whom are participating here today. We've got a pretty good squad here to tackle these problems. So if you are attending this and you're struggling, reach out to one of us. We want you to be successful, obviously, and there's a small army of people who are highly motivated for you to be successful. And I hope that you reach out to one of us. And if you're struggling, we have a number of blueprints and plans we can share with you, and we're certainly happy to do that. Was aiming for 10 minutes or less, Mr. Willis. I think that's it. And really looking forward to the questions and the comments. I always learn something when I do this, and that's why I so much look forward to it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Jay. And obviously your presentation, as usual, was quite informative. And thanks a lot for the shout out to the international trade community here. I concur. We do have a lot of resources here within the greater Kansas City area. And anybody who's interested in being able to avail themselves of those resources, people are really ready to listen, ready to participate, and ready to answer questions. So don't anybody hesitate to reach out to any number of people within the community. Well, our next presenter is Lesa Brownell. Lesa is a Global Center of Excellence Compliance Manager at TVH Parts Company Americas region, is also a certified U.S. Export Compliance Officer and certified global business professional whose responsibility includes international trade compliance, product compliance, and risk management. Lesa has over 30 years of international trade and compliance experience, traveling worldwide, helping companies to implement compliance programs. She previously worked for Honeywell FM&T, where she developed their deemed export compliance program, a supply chain management program, university trade compliance program, and worked collaboratively with the Department of Energy to write regulatory policies. Lesa volunteers as the treasurer for the International Trade Council, is a facilitator for trade wins, and in her personal time is the event planner for a nonprofit organization supporting women-owned businesses, which provides funds to local charities. She earned her master's degree in business ethics and compliance at New England College of Business and her bachelor's in international business at Park University. So Lesa, the floor, I guess it's not the floor, the webinar is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I did not prepare any slides. I wanted to keep this as an open discussion, conversation, but make several points. In the last seminar, we talked about, specifically focusing on disruption from, when you're sourcing from different suppliers, and Jay picked up on that, as far as planning to dual source raw material. So my conversation really is going to be more from a compliance perspective. We are in an ever-changing world of international laws and product regulations, environmental regulations that impact significantly the international trade community, from what you can import, what you can distribute. And when you are looking to source, have an alternate vendor, and they're not necessarily set up as a vendor. It takes time to get somebody set up, but now you're looking to have a dual source vendor to be able to provide products. There's several things you've got to be very careful about. So if they're in a region that does free trade agreements and you've determined eligibility under a free trade agreement for products, and so just an example, it's this, you're buying, it's the same part number you give to a customer, but your sourcing is from different vendors. Be careful that when you've determined eligibility of a product under a free trade agreement, now all of a sudden your materials are coming from a completely different vendor source that could significantly impact your eligibility under a free trade agreement because of the country of origin, where it's going. It could change the de minimis value that allows it. But even more important is the new regulations that are coming up with TSCA, and then your REACH and your RoHS regulations in Europe. So you've got to be able to have traceability on your bill of materials of your your goods that are coming in if you're a manufacturer, because you could be sourcing from one vendor in Taiwan, now you're changing to a different vendor, and you've obtained data and information under REACH and RoHS as it relates to, chemical substances. And now all of a sudden you don't have that information because you've just changed vendors, right? So when you're changing vendors, there's a lot of compliance factors that you have to remember to be very careful about, because it's not as easy as just to hurry up and change, because it's kind of like the image that Jay showed when he had the trickle effect, right? In changing for each of the roadmaps that everyone's impacted. It's the same impact in compliance. It is switching a methodology of who you're buying from. There has to be a defined process in who you're in that same flow process for onboarding a new vendor, because it's going to have an impact also internally with your compliance flows and your customs and trade. Also with your country of origin, right? So your database system where you log your country of origin, you're sourcing from one vendor, and now you've got an alternate vendor that you're bringing product in. Do you have a network system that's going to modify your country of origin, that you're showing on your export documents when it's going out? And then, of course, there's a lot of challenges with China in the Xinjiang region, where it's known for forced labor, and so the customs is on the high rise for seizing goods in those locations. So, you may change regions within China where you're buying goods, but still compliance regulatory requirements that you have to abide by. A lot of environmental fees, disposal fees that are occurring now with European Union and also in Canada. There's just, it's critical that when you start to diversify your supply base, right, and you're adding more resources and more locations, that to be careful of your vulnerabilities and some of those risks. Us, for example, our buying is up 45% just to keep ahead of customer demand, right? So that we can stock each of the different warehouses in the inventory, where we constantly are needing to continue to adjust the lead time just within a schedule, because, today we might get something in very quick from the supplier, but then in the next couple of months when we place another order as the scheduled order for buying a product from a vendor, now all of a sudden our lead time changes, right? Because it's all that supply and demand. How many other customers do they actually have that are coming in? So your chemical restrictions, as I had mentioned before, you have your TSCA, your PBT chemicals, your significant impact on the electronics industry, your REACH and RoHS, and even Prop 65, which Prop 65 is not new. But again, when you're changing suppliers, right, remember it's the same process for onboarding a new one, that you make sure that you get that same data and information. You also have an increased rise in OFAC and sanction concerns with your supply chain, the risk in forced labor. So it's critical that you manage the supply chain the same way that you have a supply chain management process, and that when you're onboarding a supplier, don't be so reactive to jump to a new supplier. Make sure that they're following a process to onboard so that you're getting that critical information that's also needed, because it's going to impact somebody else within the different departments within your organization on the supply chain side. So, how many people have, country of origin by vendor for the same part that, that you're sourcing? That's where you get into commingling. In knowing your suppliers, right? Who are they? Where do they source their raw materials from? We talked about this the last time. Making sure you have terms and conditions within your agreements that's talking about regulatory requirements. Supplier code of conduct is critical as well. There's when you speak OFAC language in the US, you hope that it's known, right? But as you start to speak that language in another country, they may not think that it necessarily actually applies to them. So even if you have a global agreement, a global trade, terms and conditions, you need to you can have some generalization, but you also need to speak specific U.S. regulatory laws, spelling them out, because they may not otherwise know that it's applicable to them. In conducting a risk assessment of your suppliers, some people may not necessarily be on board with CTPAT, but what that organization does, it's not saying that you need to go out and be a member of it or anything like that, but they set the standards. They set a minimum criteria of what should be done within the supply chain of knowing who your suppliers are, and it helps to build that vendor onboarding process. So just some kind of tips and things about, really about when you are starting to diversify your supply chain, when you start to, execute pre-buys, for inventory, just remember there's other people within the organization that may be impacted by your decision. Okay, especially like anti-dumping. You could have a product, the tariff classification is because anti-dumping is flagged not only by country of origin, but also by the tariff number. So you could source it from one country and it's not triggered for anti-dumping, but now you're changing who your suppliers are, and all of a sudden it's triggered by anti-dumping. Well, there goes your landed cost. It just went up, right? So are you calculating your landed costs, which if you're not, now it's going to impact your margin for when you're trying to sell your product. So there's a lot of factors to consider, and I just kind of wanted to point some of those things out and really just open the floor up for discussion.
Well, fantastic, Lesa. Very informative as usual. We very much appreciate some of the insights you're able to bring to bear. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and dive in to the questions that have been put forward to us. And of course, as usual, you'll see that some of the questions are a little bit more general, and some of the questions are extremely specific in terms of some of the challenges that folks are running into. So I will go ahead and ask the first question, and I'm going to try to bounce off between both of our presenters to see if there may be different insights that each will bring to bear in answering the question. Let me start with maybe a more general kind of a question that came in, and ask you, Jay, this one. You talked about peak seasons in your presentation. Can you expand a little bit on that? Where, when, what are the most dominant peaks, and what are the dominant business impacts and dynamics of those peak seasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was happy to see that come in. So I'll just make comments on the two big ones. So first of all, and maybe these comments kind of reflect back to when things were normal. So first of all, Chinese New Year, very, very interesting. So you're talking about, you know, a 2.5 week period where most general business in China is shut down in February. And what's interesting about that is you've got people that are basically trying to get their business concluded and trying to get freight moved and you know, trying to get transactions completed before that. And you've got this situation that we've seen over the course of the last 10 years where you've got this rising middle class in China. Lisa touched on it briefly in her comments about the labor situation in China. But you've got this rising middle class, and every year at Chinese New Year, these people, you know, basically walk off the job and don't come back. And so there's usually labor repercussions after Chinese New Year. So there's this big bubble of business activity that precedes Chinese New Year, and then there's the process of trying to get the motor running again after Chinese New Year. That's a big one. The second big one is kind of what we in the maritime shipping business just call general peak season, and this is driven by holiday merchandising primarily. So depending on who you ask, you know, peak season will be mid-August to Halloween, basically. And if you think about that, you know, that's shippers trying to get their inventories in place, trying to get their distribution models set so they can answer to holiday demand. There's a couple other little events in there. There's a you know, contract negotiation kind of event in May that impacts that, where people are out there kind of negotiating their different you know, commitments and rates and that sort of thing. But Chinese New Year and peak season are the two big ones, and humongous bumps to get through as we try to get back to normal.
All right, well, thank you. Well, Lisa, I'm going to sort of spin the question a little bit differently because you're coming at it from, I know, an end user perspective. If in light of those sort of surges or bottleneck periods that Jay just described, how does a buyer best manage that, recognizing that you have to find that kind of sweet spot, not too early, not too late, but just right to be able to make sure that you've got your product moving appropriately? And in the current climate, how do you make that judgment when you really don't have too many known reference guideposts to be able to drive that? So what's your best piece of advice in that regard?
Wow, that actually, it's interesting because we just had a supply chain management meeting earlier this week, and don't assume anything because normally November is our, you know, low time, and it was our highest. It was, I mean, there's no consistency. It is, and that's why it is a constant manual adjustment to the lead time. So we have scheduled purchase order buying with key vendors based on sales volumes. And so we have to constantly, continuously go in and update that volume. And so we may have a demand, you know, where we want 10 containers a week coming out of Ningbo, but unfortunately our, you know, supplier can't necessarily meet that demand to build fast enough, you know, for what those are. And there's really no straight answer for that other than it's a constant manual adjustment. We are actually at 6 months out in our forecasting. Where before, you know, it was 2 and 3 months, but now we've got to push it out. And as I said, our buying is up 45%. So yeah, in many cases, it seems like that we have more inventory that we have. That's not the case. As soon as it's coming in, it's going out the door, even though our buying has actually increased. So there really is no pattern. It's such unprecedented times right now. You know, it is literally just keeping up with it because our lead times in purchasing are 6 months out in projections. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for that answer. I kind of knew when I was asking that there wasn't going to be any straightforward answer, but clearly by you touching upon the subject generally, you brought forth some nuggets that I hope that the audience will appreciate. Right now, I'm going to dive into a couple of specific questions. Jay, we have a webinar attendee who did go up and take a look at your website and has a couple of questions related to some of the ways in which you manage manage freight. In reviewing the Hellman Worldwide Logistics website, great emphasis is focused on door-to-door as well as cold chain solutions. Biologics, such as blood plasma, represent a relatively high dollar per pound, high sensitivity category that require door-to-door cold chain treatment. What are the most dominant high dollar per pound product categories requiring door-to-door cold chain treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jeff. And before I answer that, I just want to say thanks to Lyndon for his great questions. I saw that and I thought, my gosh, it's been too long since I saw you, and we got to get these events going again so we can network like we used to. Yeah, Jeff. So Hellman, who we've been partnered with since 2005, has a major focus in cold chain. Cold chain is the cool buzzword for mostly temperature controlled, mostly medical related cargo. And we are really proud on our side to be one of the leaders of their entire global network of cold chain cargo. We have several clients here in the area. I think we all are familiar with the biosciences industry that we're fortunate to have in our area. But the high dollar item for us is vaccines and vaccine materials. In our case, it's mostly animal related biologics, pork, cattle, poultry. We've got it all here. But these vaccines, the value of these vaccines is absolutely amazing. I can't imagine what the comparable human value would be. But yeah, it is a door-to-door managed process, highly temperature sensitive, highly time sensitive. And what we essentially do to answer your question, Jeff, is we create an accountability system that represents the entire chain of custody of that cargo. We're using documents, but we're also using technology, both hardware and software, to manage that door-to-door delivery. And what we're looking for is variations. So these vaccines and these components can survive a brief amount of time. You know, you can take that milk out of the refrigerator and it can sit on the cabinet for a while. But if it sits too long, it's no good. Well, that's the same thing with the vaccines. And so what we've been really fortunate to work on here is, creating that invisibility of not only getting the freight where it's supposed to go on time, but also being able to account for the temperature and the physical condition of the cargo at every moment of the journey.
Well, thank you. Lesa, I'm not sure whether or not this is an area that you may have any products that fall into, but do you have any particular comments you want to add to this in your experience?
Actually, I just wanted to ask Jay a question. Is there any movement to with the governments, because obviously, ownerships of the steamship lines, are multiple governments. Is there any precedence in terms of providing priority, for certain, like the vaccines and things like that for cargo and things?
Yeah, Lesa, we just full disclosure, we have not really been exposed to that. I recall, and I think we all remember kind of as we closed out 2020 and the vaccines became a reality, there were a number of consortiums that were involved in kind of creating an SOP around how the vaccines were transported to their final destination. Candidly, on our side, we consider ourselves subject matter experts in animal vaccines and not subject matter experts in human pharma. Because we are basically a result of what our customers need us to ship.
Sure.
So I can't make a lot of comments on the human side. I'm very familiar with the SOPs on the animal side, and I know there's a big difference.
Yeah. So there's really no government intervention then that's really coming in to try to help with the containers and steamship lines and things. And
yeah, it's tricky. So I'll give you an example of so we've got a situation right now in China where the Chinese government has mandated a sanitization process of inbound cargo, and that has absolutely threw a wrench at people who are exporting time-sensitive and temperature-sensitive vaccines, because it gets all the way to its final destination and it sits subject for this sanitation process. And most of my clients, that's a deal killer. If they can't account for how long it's going to sit and wait to be processed, then you're talking about taking the risk of losing an extremely high value piece of cargo. And that's been a huge problem that we're navigating around right now. But that's not a U.S. government thing, that's a Chinese government thing, but that's just an example of what can happen with this.
Well, it gets back to the point you made last time was, really communicating with your freight forwarder to know, because the things are changing daily, and it's really keeping in communication with your freight forwarder to understand and keep up to date, regardless of whatever your cargo is, of the pitfalls of what could happen.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It's a tremendous opportunity in our business for people to make fools of themselves. It's a tough business, and if you think you can just come in and handle it easily and it works just like any other general cargo, you're going to have a very short career handling cold chain.
Well, wonderful. Well, wonderful dialogue between the two of you as well. I certainly encourage that as we move forward through these questions, because you both offer very good insights. I've just got a couple of other, again, general questions and then maybe some specifics. How does rail fit into all this right now? I've heard talk about efforts to move product by rail. I think it was to Salt Lake City, and then from the port to be able to relieve some of the congestion that might have come about by virtue of truckers not being available to be able to move. In other words, basically my question is, as you look at the multimodal kind of capabilities that are out there, is rail sufficiently flexible, or really is there just no flexibility in rail as well?
No, that's a great question, Jeff. So real quick, I'll just kind of hit the high points. So rail, as we all know, is one of those old school. It's actually one of the oldest school industries we have in our country, right? Rail basically drove the Industrial Revolution, but rail was really, really pounded by the labor problem when we got into furloughing employees and then trying to get them to come back to work and dealing with that. So that was a huge problem for the rail industry when you think about that old school blue collar, primarily unionized workforce and that sort of thing. And so real tough situation there. What we're trying to do with rail, and Jeff is great at asking leading questions, is what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that stuff away from the ports, right? We're trying to get that cargo away from the hot spots of congestion. So rail has a ton of potential for that. We're very, very lucky here in Kansas, since we have basically one of the largest rail hubs in the world in Gardner. And what does it serve? Well, it's essentially a virtual access point to the Port of Long Beach, because the BNSF brings all that freight from Long Beach right here to the Kansas City area. So what you're seeing right now, where rail is playing a role, is the limited examples of where you can reroute cargo to another port. I've seen this in some of the news channels, and let's just, instead of sending it to Long Beach, let's just send it to these other ports. Well, I wish it was that easy. It's really not that easy. But when you can do it, and let me specifically refer to like the Port of Oakland or the Port of Seattle, Tacoma. Okay, now you're talking about leveraging the rail infrastructure to get that cargo inland. That takes a whole different path. It costs a different, and it's a whole different kind of supply chain timeline than what people are used to it coming from Long Beach. So definitely some great opportunities with rail, rail and trucks. We're trying to get that cargo away from the hotspots. That's the role that it plays.
Well, let me just ask a quick follow-up to that, and that is, from an end user perspective, from a small or medium-sized business that is making use of your freight forwarding services, Are you engaging in a lot of dialogue back and forth as you examine efficiencies with that might entail movement to a different port to try to avoid the congestion that's on the West Coast, considering some of the rail options? You indicated that it does have implication, obviously, with regards to the length of time that shipment's going to be in process. How does that process go through, and what's the best way for a company to be able to interact with you and provide information to you so that you can optimize their movement of goods?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. So just put a little context around that. You know, a rail voyage of a cargo or a container full of cargo from the port of Long Beach to Kansas under normal circumstances is probably about a 7 to 9 day hike. Now, under normal circumstances, you build that timeline into your overall transit time, and so you're typically talking about, you know, maybe 22 to 26 days port to port, another 7 to 9 days inland. Things work pretty well. That part of it is actually working pretty well. As where the bottleneck is the port. So we you know, getting the ships unloaded, getting the material to the rail hub, getting it on the rail. That's really where the major problem is. Once it's on the rail, we're in pretty good shape. That's easy to plan for. So what you're seeing right now is kind of a backwards ripple effect, where people will say, well, I can't figure out, we can't take it to the rail. We have to take it over to this warehouse, cross dock it, unload it, basically put it on a truck, and then bring it inland, which is great because that's quicker than the rail, but it's also much more expensive. And now you've got a situation where everybody's doing that. And so, you know, if you believe that statistic I dropped a little while ago, that there's less than 1% available warehouse space within 100 miles of the port of Long Beach, you know, think about how far that container has to go just so it could get unloaded to get reloaded to come here. It's just the rail situation just was never optimized for that kind of volume. So so the rail part of things is actually playing a pretty stable role in all this, because that system is kind of doing what it's supposed to do as long as the cargo is fed to it properly.
Well, just another quick follow-up, and you really can just provide a quick answer if you want, and that is there any difference between, for the end user, again, as they make plans to try to deal with this present situation, between LTL and full container? How does that, you know, if they can, do they just go ahead and say, hey, we'll try to get that full container because it offers certain efficiencies or advantages in the offload process, or what have you?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jeff. So, you know, full container is always better if you can do it. It's cheaper. You've got an economy of scale because you're paying for the entire box. The LCL is great, and it has to be used for smaller items of cargo, but it adds time and handling on both sides of the transaction, and both sides of the transaction are both big bottlenecks right now. So avoiding LCL, if possible, is one solution that you can use to mitigate things, because your experience will go better. The shipment will go faster if you can stay away from LCL.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Jay. Hey, I have a question for you, Lesa, and Jay, weigh in if this ventures in, because you sort of overarch a lot of this stuff too. But Lesa, from your experience, have there been any post-COVID adaptations or workarounds made to Incoterms 2020?
So I'm probably different than most people in the industry. Of the 11 Incoterms, we use 4, and that's it. Working globally in so many different areas, I see that different aspects from multiple different companies and organizations, and what that it is. And so FOB is not an option. Everything that we import is freight collect. We move everything FCA that is imported in. And when we export, if we're shipping to a customer's freight forwarder, you know, it's FCA. But we have DAP term, you know, that we use, and just, you know, briefly, my reason behind that is from a customer perspective, right? So the CIF terms, the CFR terms, which is ocean only, and then you've got the CPT and the CIP terms, which is any mode of transportation. Those are only taking you up to a named location. And so if I'm a customer in South America and I've contracted with, my vendor to say, hey, transport this freight prepaid and had on my documentation, that's great, but I get something damaged, the risk falls back, right? It actually goes to the customer. And they're like, well, hold on, I just contracted with you and it's your carrier, you transported it, right? So from a customer perspective, and that is really the biggest thing with Incoterms that nobody really looks at, is looking at it from all perspectives, right? DAP, your risk and your costs align up. So a customer is going to be more happy with you if you're using the DAP term instead. So I can't say that COVID has made a difference because I set the rules when I got here. This is all you're using.
Well, fantastic. Thanks a lot for all that insight. Jay, anything you want to add? We're kind of working towards the end, so I'm going to try to pop in another couple of questions here before the end.
I tell you what, if that might have been the best little gem of knowledge of the whole presentation, what Lesa just said is pick 2 or 3 or 4 Incoterms that work for you and stick with them. I don't think there's a better piece of international trade advice that you're going to hear all year right there.
I certainly had the same reaction, but it's good to hear that validation from you as well. Thanks a lot. Let's check another question here. Jay, can you also expand on how finance folks are adapting to supply chain challenges? Something that you touched upon that we have a viewer who would like to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. When we talk about the supply chain mess, we think about all of us in the freight world, with migraine headaches, but this has been tremendously hard on finance people. Finance people have been absolutely hammered by this. So you got a couple things going on. First of all, your cost of transportation in some cases has gone up 5, 6, 7, 8 times. So Lesa mentioned earlier that you're trying to manage landed cost of a piece of material that you're sourcing. Might be sourcing from across the street, might be across the world, but your cost that goes into that piece of material has changed wildly. That's one of the areas that finance people have really been stressed. Another area that you've seen where we've talked about vetting suppliers, adding new suppliers. What we've seen clients do is renegotiate their terms with suppliers. So to get that freight moved and to get the POs accepted, they're going in there and saying, hey, instead of doing a net 30 or net 45, we're going to pay you via ACH or via wire net 10. So we're going to make ourselves more attractive as a customer to you to gain your favor and try to manipulate the system. We see a lot of that going on. The other thing is inventory. So now you've got all these inventories that are so late they have to be held over until the next selling season. Okay, you can imagine what that does to the balance sheet of a company, which inventory is probably one of their biggest assets. You've got inventory that you thought you were going to sell here in the next week that probably won't be sold maybe until next holiday season. So that's a big deal. Real quick story on this, Jeff, I know we're trying to wrap up, but I had lunch with a client yesterday and he told a very sad story. They're a manufacturer of a really neat piece of equipment. It's kind of a specialized piece of equipment. And they got so upside down with their suppliers that they're selling this piece of equipment like hotcakes. And the CFO told me yesterday face to face that it's basically kind of like the equivalent of taping a $20 bill to each one of them as they go out the door, because that's what they're losing on every single unit because the supply chain got so backwards on it. One of their top sellers, and they're losing money on every unit because of the problem. So it really stinks to go around and hear stories like that, but we're kind of blessed to be at the table helping solve those problems. But
COVID was not such the impact in the sense that we were already making plans because of Section 301 China provision. I mean, we have over 750 tariffs that are impacted under Section 301 from a 25% provisional tariff. And so we were already adjusting landed costs for those, right? And so it's a constant monitoring of making sure to adjust your landed cost for the freight charges that was just accelerating, right, in the cost. And so that made it even more difficult. But one of the things we are doing from a finance perspective is moving away from advance payment with our vendors, you know, because it's taking so long for products and things to be able to get in. You know, we've got money going out the door, but nothing, you know, no products in to be able to start selling. So for us, we don't have inventory that's staying on the shelves, which is a good thing, because we're unloading a lot of containers and things are, and even air freight shipments as well. And as soon as it's here, it's going out the door. So, yeah.
Well, great insights from both of you. We are now at the end of our hour period here. I encourage any of the webinar attendees to reach out directly, I'm sure, to either of these presenters today. They're both International Trade Council leadership, and so I know that they are very concerned about ensuring that our community is well served. And so I thank them again for a wonderful, insightful presentation. We look forward to continuing the dialogue, because clearly we've got some time to be able to manage this challenge going forward. So again, I want to thank both of our presenters for some really insightful comments, and thank all the webinar attendees as well. We look forward to our next month's event. Please stay tuned to our announcements, and we look forward to your attendance. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.